horror.
Oh man, the water wars. That's the real stuff from Mexico.
Yeah. This
Topo
is actually
Chico?
kind of, I like to rotate because, they all have different minerals. So
Yeah. If you drink nothing but Topo Chico, you get I've had, that you can have problems with mineral buildup.
Yeah.
You have to be careful.
Well, that's why I said that, because I drank Pellegrino straight. That was it for years, and learned that the hard
Stones?
way, actually.
Did you get stones?
No, nothing that bad.
Oh, that's so lucky. They're now also, because we have sonication, they can use sound waves to deal with stones. But you have to imagine in the old days, Earl of Rochester days, where they just get you drunk and hold you down and just
I had them as a kid.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I was, I don't know, single digits, 8, 9, 10, something like that. Yeah.
Wow. Do you know how you got stoned? How did it happen?
Nope.
Just from food, minerals?
Poor diet is what people postulate, but it's
dry foods. Did you eat a lot of cereal?
Lots of cereal. My parents had no dietary understanding whatsoever. It was a lot of soda, a lot of cereal for sure.
Salts and
crazy,
cereals.
Man. That whole cereal thing, I went down that wormhole, and man, talk about some heavy metals. Yeah, I have a severe heavy metals allergy, which was actually a blessing, because that got me away from chemicals early.
Oh yeah.
So shampoos and deodorants and all that stuff.
Yeah, I had a hexane allergy as a baby. So that's apparently a petroleum-based mineral they used to clean soy. So I had soy milk and
dude, man,
I lucked
too
out
similar.
for that. Yeah.
My mother, she didn't want to breastfeed because she was the breadwinner, and so she had to go back to work. So she didn't want to, get that whole thing going and pump and all that. So she tried to get me on formula, and I was severely allergic to formula. So they got me on this weird soy, which, as you know, pretty much just poisoned me for the first 2 years of my life.
Yeah, see, my mom was down but she couldn't, because she's an OBGYN, so she agreed that she should be around. But at the same time, there's very little you can.
My mom worked for OB for 30 years.
Man. And then you can't be you can't take care of your kid. You can't. It's like the carpenter who can't work on their house. Well, all right. I think we just entered in the most interesting eavesdrop into reality, guys. This is Analog. I'm Andreas Exertus, and welcome to the Tartary chat. How you doing, man?
Pleasure. Glad to be here.
We're gonna try to unpack a lot. Actually, this is gonna be kind of a big one. We've been talking a lot, and if you've seen Analog talking to Victor or doing his radio show, he does a lot of research, and we've been wanting to do something for a year or more. Every time we talk, it's let's make a video about that, and then more and more research happens. So now you're in trouble because you're gonna have to do it all at once, but it'll probably be okay.
Yeah, it'll go better that way. I'm used to that with Victor.
Nice. Well, I think we can start basically anywhere you want. We can talk a little bit about that too. You've done a lot of information about the Celts and the Tartarians, and what's your background? How did you get into all of it?
In 2007, I had a motorcycle accident, and had that near-death experience thing, and never looked back, honestly. I was pretty much stuck in a chair, lazy boy, hospital bed for the better part of 9 months. And with all that free time, I just led to endless reading, and pretty much blew the door open from there. I spent a lot of time trying to understand what it was that I experienced, near-death experience-wise. And I came across a book by a neurosurgeon. I'm spacing the name right now. But basically, he had a...
Is he Indian? Ramachandran?
No, nope. Oh. He had some funky... Man, I can't remember what it was. Some brain-eating disease. And he was in the hospital, and he died 6 or 7 times, and he wrote about the experience, and he dedicated the next 5 years of his life to proving that it wasn't some hallucination, which is what everyone was telling him. And that book just pretty much changed my life and led me down to re-educating myself essentially, and from history to food to biology, all of it. And I've just never looked back. And I would say from there, it ventured into genealogy and blood. And I always wondered what this whole Rh negative blood type thing was. It felt like a scam at first, and then as I got more into it, it got super interesting. And then I started to make all these connections with my parents and my mom's bloodline and where we came from, because my parents weren't interested in that at all, and I was super interested in it, but they couldn't really give me any information. So chasing that led me all over the world basically, and then from there I wanted to learn their history, and that got me to the Scots, Celts, the Basques, the Berbers, and then following them and chasing them all over the world in America and shit. I mean, every year my opinion of all that changes, and even recently, the last 2 months or so, it's really been, I don't want to say changing, but I feel like the pieces are kind of all coming together,
evolving more. So, what do you think about your parents were Mormons, right? Is that correct?
No, I married into a prominent Mormon family.
Ah,
my mother was Southern Baptist, and my father was Protestant Christian, but his parents weren't really active. But his father became a born again later in life, but he was raised in a super poor, abusive family. And yeah, my mom, she shied away from religion because her family was super, super strict. So I was raised in a house where there wasn't really any explanation about life or anything, religion, God. It's kind of, I was left on my own, which at the time was hard, but now I'm pretty grateful for it. I kind of figured it all out on my own. I didn't have to break any, paradigm or any kind of childhood, physical or mental, religious, molding. It was
objection.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that really prepared me for later in life, but yeah, I mean,
with the Mormonism, did it like change your view on history? Did you think that it sounded crazy that there could have been no prehistory?
Growing up, I actually had quite a few really close Mormon friends, and I've been to seminary. I've gone to church with them plenty of times, and so it wasn't like uncomfortable for me at all. And I met my wife and fell in love with her like that, and I just decided I was going to do whatever I could to fit into her life, and here we are.
So when you thought about your link in history and finding out what happened before America, how does that make you feel? Like the Mormon narrative, does that tie in? And what have you found about that?
Oh man, the Mormon narrative is just incredibly interesting, and the more you get into it, the more questions I really end up having. But I say they, Joseph Smith's understanding of America and its history, and his translation of these golden tablets and what ended up becoming the Book of Mormon is absolutely incredible. I mean, it's an underrated text without a doubt, especially it's Mexican, Central American, and what I believe is their, essentially Olmec relation, which
right.
That's a tough one and could take forever to explain. But for anyone that knows, their explanation is that their predecessors essentially after the Tower of Babel. And again, I've made connections between these groups coming from Tartary. That's in their own text as well. They don't quite use that language. They landed on the western coast of Mexico, and the rest is history.
Right. And the interesting, I mean, like just looking at the idea of the Mormon deluge, like leaving a flood from Egypt, you have Noah's 5 sons have 5 wives from 5 nations. And so you have a multiracial prehistory, which seems to be something that we keep seeing more and more, is like a connection in the past to people working together, interacting with each other. And that's what, like, Latin America is fundamentally, South America was built on different tribes interacting with each other. So it seems like it's weirdly more accurate anthropologically than we originally thought it was. Or the way it was treated.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of relations with, what I am starting to believe is more of the original biblical lands, being the Americas. But yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, even if you take out the idea of them sailing on a ship, South America to me is like the early foundations of what makes Tartary, and ethnic and racial and all of these things. Even though those words I'm starting to become even more wary of, because those have been completely bastardized. You know what I'm getting at, and it's really
Well, I was going to say, like, because we were looking at South America, and some of the thing that led into this idea of this, like, well, we have to make this talk thing, was some of the research that you found on bringing people back and forth from one place to another, especially children, foundling stuff. And I don't know, actually, if you have some of that stuff, we could actually like screen share some of that and go into that if you want.
Well, first let's start with Kathleen, I'm spacing Kathleen, right? The Great.
Catherine the Great, from Russia to Belgium. Yeah.
And you, I think, have quite a really good understanding of the whole takeover of the crown and murdering her husband, and having people.
Yeah, I recommend a lot is this Russian series that came out in like 2014, I think it was, and it's got subtitles, but it's like literally called Catherine the Great. And it was a really good quick watch, like I think it's like 12 episodes, but it's a really accurate story because they filmed it in all the castles on location in Russia with Russian, it's made by Russia, so it's better. But like it's less Hollywood, but you have this woman who is German, Austrian German, like I think she's Bavarian or Austrian. She was brought to St. Petersburg, which is a very Germanic part of Russia, the northwestern, kind of culture, as opposed to the far east or the south, or what Moscow is very different. And they had so many crazy people that she ended up in charge eventually. People just kept dying around, and who she married was this insane king, and he had a prince who had syphilis and was as babies, and they show this happening to her children. The royals were never allowed to see them. As soon as they're removed from the womb, they're taken away from the mother, and it's beyond no breastfeeding. It's like, they're taken care of by the Masons and raised by Masonic scholar tutors, and they're pushing them further and further towards democratic governance as this mechanism that's very convenient for a royal to employ, whilst also disconnecting them from their mother, who's already not Russian because they've moved them around. And it shows you how this what are they calling it? The Livonians, or the Livonian Swiss Russians, which are essentially like a Scandinavian group, had created a re-establishment of their confederacy. And they did this slowly, but over 100 years, it was pretty obvious what was going to happen was they were going to destroy Russia. They were going to destroy all the royal families. And Catherine let it happen. But simultaneously, the Jesuits were found in trouble because in South America, they'd been going around, like they invented wearing black. They told the CIA how to do it. They would grab people's technology, but it was magic ritual technology even then. So they would use it, and eventually they got in some trouble, and you could blame a lot of reasons, but the most reasonable, least theoretical reason is that they had Paraguay had turned into a place in the middle of South America where 99% of everyone were literate, had university-style educations, it was just beyond anything you've ever seen in the world at the time. There was technology, brick Tartarian buildings. It was a Jesuit society. And and they by law made everyone marry another race so that there could not be classism based on race. Very fascinating. But they from 3 angles were destroyed by the Triple Alliance War of Bolivia, Brazil, and Argentina, where 99% of the population was wiped out, even women and children. And the few women that were left ended up marrying men from Brazil or Argentina to sort of rebuild Paraguay. And they still drink cold tereré instead of hot tea because they can't have smoke from the fires that they remember in 1800s. So Paraguay's got an interesting history from being completely wiped out. It's also the only country that still uses its own language, Guarani, in South America instead of Spanish as its #1 language. So it's like Tibet in South America.
Wow.
But they it's a foundling country that they brought people to afterwards and completely restarted. But at that moment, after the Triple Alliance War, especially, the Jesuits were excommunicated by the Catholic Church. The entire order was not allowed to be Catholic anymore, which is a huge deal. And all their land and everything that belonged to them still belonged to the church. So it was given to the Franciscans, the Greys. So the blacks, the Greys, and the brown shirts, and the white shirts, the Benedictines. So eventually.
What year was it all the time frame-ish?
So Neo, we don't know what year it really is. This is the thing that's the whole Matrix metaphor comes from this, because we have no idea what the calendar actually is based on this. And I'll tell you, it's like 1700s, there's 50 years, maybe 100 years that the Jesuits were excommunicated. 50 years is what's on the books, supposedly 1700s. But what ends up happening from the late 1600s to 1700s is after 50 years, the Jesuits, who've been hiding under Catherine the Great's control, and they have outposts, and I think they're especially out of Belgium, but Russia has, St. Petersburg has set them up there through the Freemasons. The Jesuits allowed the Freemasons aren't allowed to be part of the Catholic Church. Originally, there's an excommunication statute. If you're part of one, you're excommunicated from the other, and that was so that they could have Jesuits that were still Freemasons that were para, and then they got shut down. So the Jesuit Freemason connection is a lot closer than people realize at that point. But Catherine the Great let them exist. 50 years or so later, they got another guy into power in the Vatican who became the Pope, and they killed the last guy to get this guy in power. Once this happens, they dig up the Pope a few times before he would excommunicated him. They took his corpse and put him on trial, and he lost. And they excommunicated his soul, pulled it out of heaven, sent it down to hell, burned his body. I actually forget if they buried it under stairs so that people have to walk up the stairs. Monks have to walk on the stairs above his body every time they pray every day to ring the bell, or something to desecrate his grave. And And so they burned all of his work. So everything that happened, it's not like, we had a prohibition of alcohol, then we changed our mind. And it shows we had a prohibition and then we changed our mind. There's an amendment and then there's another amendment, No, with the Jesuits, they just burned him, burned his books, and burned all the records, burned all the history. And then they said, let's just start back from right before that happened.
Man, and there's something to be said about that dark magic of desecration of the body, man. Digging somebody up. I mean, that's
it's a popular thing with them for some reason.
Yeah. And I mean, that as deep as we go, I mean, that's going to be really relevant here. And I think the next 6 months, maybe even more geopolitically, and Victor's touched on this stuff, and it's deep with the bones and the blood and the buildings, building your edifices out of their bodies,
I've always been really weird about cremation. I wouldn't advise anyone any which way on life or death situations, God forbid. But at the same time, Bob Marley refused to get cremated. He didn't want to get amputated because the Rastafarians believe that you have to be whole to exist in the afterlife. And so it's interesting that they really, really push on people cremation. They really do.
Yeah.
They're they want everyone to do it. And you're like, what? You of all people don't need that. And they're like, oh, yeah.
Yeah, it is weird. You find that, again, not to go to the Jupiter reference, but you find a lot of the countries that do that style of burning of bodies, that is a very much a Jehovian mindset. And yeah, it's definitely a red flag to me too. I like to think I'd like to be buried in a mound, with things around me that I've collected over my life that have meaning. Whether or not, that people always like to pass off the idea that you're going to be taking these things into the afterlife, but it's a lot better of a sounding thing than being, shoved into the freaking river in India. It's just crazy, that idea, with all those people burning all those bodies and chunks of ash floating down the river.
Freeze me and cast me into space with Tom Cruise and Walt Disney.
Oh, jeez. Is that what they did?
I don't know if he's in space. I don't know if he's in space.
I don't either. I mean,
I think he's underground. I'm pretty sure. I actually had a video a while ago. I think he's in Missouri, from where his old town is, because Disney bought this whole area there, and it's super safe. And they have their own generators facility there, and it's super, like, the amount of energy it's using. Like, what's the most ridiculous possible thing they could be doing with it? Keeping Walt Disney frozen properly.
Yeah. No, see, and again, this is why I'm so happy to sit down and have this conversation with you. Is I knew it was going to go so many places.
Well, I mean, like, the weird thing is Foundlings went so many places. You could basically take, like, any number of weird people in history, and they all go back to, like, he was found on a freaking train, like, almost every time. It's like, and especially, like, you got these, like, any world places in the middle of America, like Missouri, where the records, because of a mud flood or whatever circumstance that we've been looking at, they've destroyed a records building, they've destroyed the post office, they've destroyed the newspapers. And so 100 years of news is gone. You've no idea what happened before that,
Yeah. And then, this ties in with so much of what has been so fabulous about this Discord community is you have all these people with such a different mindset, that you can throw some idea or some bit of information out there, and you're going to have 4, 5, 6, 20 people giving you, like, such a different view of it. And, 13th Monkey, nod to him. He has just changed my whole look at all of these things. And I've tied so much of my Titan, Olympus, Greek, whatever, Battle of the Gods stuff that has some kind of allegorical story to the physical more and more lately. Stellium's work, it's just crazy. And Stellium's work, it really has been resonating a lot with me. And like I said, we started talking about blood and, haplogroups and DNA and all these things. And you just find more and more that these fundamental parts of our lives have been built around these principles of desecration, against, Titans, essentially. It's as crazy as that's going to sound. And you brought up, mud flood in America, and the gridding of America from the Rocky Mountains all the way to the East Coast is absolutely mind blowing. Like, when people say, give me a list of a few things about Tartary or, revisionist history that would really give me something to stand back to. And I always go to Google Earth, and that's a slippery slope, but it's absolutely mind blowing, the gridding stuff, because that's going to tie in with what we've been talking about with mounds, mound takeovers, star forts, grid cities, the founding fathers, the Iroquois, Basques. I mean, shit, this is all tied in together, and it has a lot of really amazing and powerful roots in America, especially in that part of America you were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible looking at all of the heartstones that Mike Selliams collected. I mean, well, he can't look at all of them because he gets more and more every day. Like, today I was talking to him, and he showed me one he found, like, while he was walking.
Yeah.
So it's like you start to see that there's this pattern in things, and this Titan singularity milieu ecosystem thing has also been really, like, how much of life do you think, or how much of geology, I guess, do you think these, like, geological or, ecological systems are alive? And, like, what does that mean to you? Like, what do you think about that?
Man, so much of it. I was, funny enough, listening to a podcast this morning, and they were talking about basically artificially created soil. And there's such a large area of it in Brazil that it covers a landmass greater than Great Britain, and it's 20 feet deep, and it's the most perfect pH balance. It's the most perfect vibrationally stable. It's like everything you would need a soil to raise, billions of people on and build the most insane architecture you've ever seen. It's all right there. And not only that, the soil has the exact same signature, and they find it in Australia, Brazil, like I said, South America, more in Mexico. They found it in Africa, and with the same type of signature. Again, it's covering absolutely massive amounts of land, and it's basically, again, this whole idea of terraforming the planet. And when you think that, again, having all of this information can kind of lead you astray, but when you have all these other things, when it comes to looking again from such a drastically outside of the norm scale of things, what could grid the whole planet? What could cover the planet in canals? What could do all these
Fungus.
things? Yeah, and it just sends your mind, like we're talking about, orphan trains and all these things, and it's just like, to me, that's just like such a detail. It's such a small detail, even though it's not. But these large geomantic projects, I don't know what else you'd call it. There's no other way to describe it than something far beyond even Tartary. You know what I mean? I mean, that whole terraforming thing, I'm sure you've touched on that a little bit past, but that's just fucking mind-blowing to me. A land the size of Great Britain, covered in 20 feet of the exact same engineered soil that is resistant to earthquakes, grows perfect food, blah, 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 is electromagnetic. It's crazy because this ties in with the mound builders too, and the transformation between mound builders to star forts, and then from star forts to star cities, and then the grid cities, and then the big grids that cover whole continents. And the founding fathers, again, I'm going through this book right now, Ross Ben.
Oh, nice.
And this book is crazy because I've owned it since it came out. Read it the day I got it, but now I'm going through it again, and it's just like reinforcing again this narrative I've been saying, that the founding fathers, if you follow, the John Quincy Adams, the Jeffersons, Washington, they built their homes on top of these mounds, and that was part of the grid takeover. That was part of the takeover of Philadelphia, which I believe is one of the most geomantically powerful nodes in the world. The
Definitely,
the natives of the Susquehanna River, they say it is the oldest river in the world, and it's, the root of the river goddess worship, which, again, we could hop right over to Scotland, to Ireland. I mean, you can take the river goddess worship stuff across the whole world, essentially.
Well, and also hydroelectric, right? Because like Minneapolis and Philadelphia, have these crazy hydroelectric systems hundreds of years before anyone else is doing. It's the same stuff that they're installing now. They're just now trying to figure out how to do.
And they still don't have it. They still don't have it down like they did then. And this ties in again with some of the tunnel stuff we've been talking about. And from Minnesota to New York is unbelievable canal systems, unbelievable hydroelectrics, and it's all, 1700s.
Did you see the talk with Philip Druginin and Steven on Baked and Awake, the podcast we did on the...
I didn't see the whole thing, but I did see the glacial melting and the weight of reduction on the soil, and all of that I think is very relative, but for me, it's just too slow of a time period.
Yeah, no way. I don't think it's that slow. My thought is really that it's you have places that were Scythian style mounds like in Mexico that are they're pyramid like Burning Man like caravans that are really sophisticated are showing up at and leaving. And so, if you think about what it's like with a sophisticated radio-based society, you're not really tethered in such a way that it has to be permanent. So for the most part, you want something that's really plastic and is flexible and you can replace and you change if you're moving around. So I think it speaks of two different kinds of cultures interacting. I mean, especially because it looks like the layout of pyramids. Like there's a reason for that, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's so true because, you know, the early texts I can find about star forts, they come from Spain and France. And they all say the same thing, that these weren't places where people lived. That, again, it was a nomadic, wandering type of cultures that would all meet at these points for ritual. And then you see the absolute change of that. You know, you go from the star forts, which from the earlier pictures, there aren't cities in them. And then you start to see people being forced into the cities. And I think that's post some kind of manipulation, whether it's post a mud flood or a cataclysm, I don't really know. But again, forcing this will get someday we'll get into egregores and that type of stuff. But this is, again, the purpose of the hive mind and, you know, the parasite mind, and getting people forced into these nodes post some kind of manipulation or flip of the node, and developing this kind of matrix again, the reverse, the not non-positive. But yeah,
absolutely,
that was a run on set. Yeah. But you get what I'm saying.
Hey, you know, like I think Martin Luther King has like a page and a half run-on sentence that they made us like study in school because it was correct. So yeah, don't worry, man. Like you're doing fine, I think. But yeah, if you've got, do you want to pull up some of the screen share stuff? Maybe we could look at some of the
data. I'm gonna pull up, since we talked about Catherine the Great a lot. I think that was a perfect transition because the excerpt that I found that was like one of the most mind-blowing ones for me was the one mentioning that the largest baby farm in the world was created by her in Moscow. And they had over 15,000 children, and they were getting 50 minimum babies delivered every day. And for me, that was just absolutely mind-blowing, because after going through a lot of this stuff, it's really hard to find anything like that, names, you know what I'm saying? Especially countries. A lot of these older texts, they're just going to describe, you know, some kind of news story in a city or something like that. But this one I'm going to share. Hopefully it's not so hard for everybody to see. It's a bit small. But yeah, so this one is pretty messed up, and I'll just read through it, or I can highlight it, whichever you prefer.
Is there a way to zoom in on that, or is that as big as it goes?
I can go much further if you need me to.
I see two screens at once. I just don't see why I see two screens. Can that window be full screen? So you just...
Because I did it wrong. That's why.
Science.
First time. Hey,
science, man. There you go.
You have me on mute. I'm sharing the wrong screen.
Dude, you guys didn't even see that. That was hilarious. I was like, check your mic. Check your mic. Oh, wait. Check my mic.
Okay, so this is an ad from 1918. And it is paired next to an Uncle Sam ad that's talking about serving your country, blah, blah, blah. But this
nothing weird on that. What's it say? Uncle Sam's what?
Uncle Sam's new baby farm.
Sam's new baby farm.
The place where they are saving 100,000 babies for the nation of tomorrow. There are a lot of catch words in this one. Yeah, I can already see.
It's like a sperm bank, but better. Yeah. This is Orphan Annie, the home game.
I think this one we can just talk about for a while because it's going to lead us in a lot of directions. But perhaps you thought Uncle Sam was busy making war. Well, he is, but he finds time on the side to run a nursery that makes the old women who lived in a shoe look like a mere beginner. The fact that that's in quotations is also noteworthy. Probably you're wondering where this baby farm is. It's all over the country. The entire United States, and every home where a new baby is spreading happiness, and Uncle Sam is running it from the Children's Bureau at Washington with many kindly words of advice, so that the 100,000 babies will grow up to health and happiness, who otherwise might find the world too much for them. feel free to stop me at any time. Okay.
I don't know. I mean, like, obviously everyone would want you to stop killing babies or raising babies or whatever. And who's to say, right? Because they could be getting them into great homes, but it's pretty clear that they're raising babies. Is everyone clear on that? I think that's what they're saying.
Yeah. For me, this has incubator exhibition written all over it. If I had to guess, Foundling's delivered, to these mechanisms, right? These distribution centers, which is what they are.
Children's Bureau is something we're going to definitely need to look more into because this is capital CB. And 3 times as dangerous to be a baby as it is to be a soldier. So, like, indeed. I mean, that's that's a lot to say. There are only 4 deaths per year in the Allied armies out of every 100 men engaged, but 12 babies out of every 100 die that same year in the United States. I mean, so what are they really? They're not saying why the babies are dying, are they? Does it get into that?
We'll see. The language gets even weirder. You can keep reading. I like you reading, please, because then you stop and have dialogue.
Fair enough. Yeah, we'll trade. It's like a hot potato. No wonder the government has made up its mind to save this big part of the nation of tomorrow. Let's see how they go about it. Of course, the most important thing of all is the baby's feeding. Babies were intended to live, not die, and if they get a chance, they grow up and bloom as naturally as a healthy flower. So Uncle Sam has issued a bulletin telling mothers how to feed their babies, and the mothers who follow his instructions are doing their big part for the nation. The Big Babies Farm that stretches all over the United States, has its capable helpers. First, the doctors. Second, the retail druggists who give so much valuable advice to worried mothers. And third, the mothers themselves. All 3 are working for better, healthier babies. And as a result, down will go the infant mortality. Fewer babies will die, and 100,000 homes will be made happy, which would otherwise be desolate. What year is this again?
1918.
Okay, so the advance in scientific knowledge, which will save these 100,000 babies, is one of the blessedest things in the whole world. Think what it means to a mother to be able to go into a drugstore and get not only sane and sensible advice on how to feed her baby, but also the food itself, as exactly adapted to her baby's needs, as if it were made up by the greatest baby specialists in the world. If you have a baby, or if you know of a baby who is not growing or gaining weight as he should, probably his food is at fault. Find out from your druggist what baby food is compelled in itself. Made out of milk, get the government bulletin on the care and feeding of children. The nation is wide awake to saving the babies. They are the United States of tomorrow. Some of the merchants offer presents for the first babies born and reported to the Times office after midnight, June 1st. So you get prizes for babies born after June 1st, which is close to Bohemian Grove cremation of care time. It is 1918, so you could say, well, we need you to have babies in case we need to kill them later. Maybe we need them for soldiers. That's like the least skeptical reason.
Yeah, I mean, reading between the lines, though.
Yeah, they definitely are. There's a point of this which is like, we need your babies' lives. It seems like.
Yeah, I mean, to me, and again, the time thing is so difficult, and I don't want to stick to like time frames so much, but just going by the exhibitions and all of those things and what we know about incubators being such a big role in those, and how it's so difficult to find any business relationship beyond those exhibitions. It's like they just appear as part of this, or as that being a precedent for it. And again, people have brought up the fact of who are these people that can afford, because people were coming from all over the nation to go to these things, which I don't buy for a second. The clothing is strange. The technology is strange. Why represent all of these things to burn them all down? Again, the narrative of the exhibition, I think, has something really scantily tied to, again, the mounding takeover and this right here. the growing the emphasis on the word tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
The nation of tomorrow. I mean, we've heard that so many times, and for me, that is just like so reset-y.
It's not a state; it's a nation. You know, it's a legal. It's like the Nation of Islam, or it's a
Exactly.
nation of right.
Yeah. They're not. Yeah, they're not using the same language. You know, you find something like this, and it feels like it's a movie script.
It's
Right.
very it's got very NLP, neuro linguistic programming, and it does remind me a
100%.
lot of the Podesta email kind of like insinuation thing. Where is this newspaper article from? What state?
Oh, geez. It's Midwest. I can't remember.
Uh-huh.
It's something Midwest
It
in
was
that
like
region.
Michigan or one of those.
It was Michigan, Indiana, Nebraska, in that area. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
No, you don't find any. You don't find anything juicy like this on the West Coast almost at all, and you don't really find anything good like this in the Northeast. I don't know if it's because they just had a tighter grip on articles like this, or the digitization isn't as or is more controlled. I don't really know, but man, the Midwest is where all of the good refinement of these articles between 1830, something like that, and 1920. It's weird because there's this weird gap between early 1800s to 1830s, and then like 1850s to 1880s. I don't know what was going on, but
Ben Franklin kind of demanded that they import as many Scandinavians to the Midwest as possible. It could be that it was a specific like plan to like get certain people to breed as many people as possible, and then to like, as it says, baby farm across the United States. So
yeah.
this nation's cultivating, you know, and they have meticulous records on who's having babies. So I mean that there's no level where this isn't creepy, but it's also you can see how ingrained it is and systemic that it could even just make sense. That's kind of the messed up part, and how much more intense it was then when there was less oversight and they're throwing babies, you know, foundlings and trains and things. Well, I don't know. Do you want to go to the next another thing?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll find the next one if you want to. I think this is also again going to tie in with some of the railroad stuff we've talked about too. Um,
Exactly.
slave labor, the digging out of all of the nation, basically west of Omaha, I would say, is
I wanted to remember where the city was for that reason because I know that Minneapolis was one of them. Omaha was another
yeah,
one of them. And each time we find these places in the Midwest, they're major train spots. Similarly, in
exactly.
California, Stockton has Sacramento,
Yeah,
which are major human trafficking and drug and all kinds of issues around the train spots. So
I think that's a big one for Mexico. You know, you keep hearing about tunnels, and that's just shit to blow you off the real scent, which is for me, it's going to be the more legitimate ways of getting these things into the country, because you know the mining companies, the shipping companies, they're all one and the same, and taking all this stuff back, like I said, to kind of a black magic, really, and the inversion of these systems that were created for good, but now they're trafficking children through them. They're practicing their black magic inside of these sacred sites. Just the rebranding of names, and this also makes me think of the mirroring of American cities to, you know, to Europe, right? That's what we're always told, is that these places came secondary and that they were named after what was across the Atlantic. But I'm starting to kind of rethink that whole narrative. And when you have Native American stories that are telling you the same thing, and that whether or not it's a war of blood or not, the narrative keeps coming back to slavery. I don't want to use the word slavery because the older you go in text, you keep finding the word migration. What do you think
yeah,
about that?
well, so I like uplifting recently, and I've got a bunch of everything that you've been talking about in the last, conversation, I've made like 3 videos I haven't quite released yet.
Okay.
So one of them is the stellium thing, and like you're gonna like it. It's a cartoon, and then the other one is I've got like the dolphin like explanation for like why the heck I've been talking about echo, and like so the real reason is actually because of uplift, and uplift is this idea of like there's a book series where these one alien race will uplift another species. So in exchange for that, like if you were a human were to take a monkey and make it into a space monkey, or take a dolphin and make them into like a pilot dolphin or something like that with like whatever amounts of uplifting, then the dolphin owes like 100,000 or 200,000 years of bondage debt to the human. And a lot of species have done this through space, according to the series. But when they come to Earth, they find that they don't have a master race, which is really confusing, and that humans are like this lone thing, which they kind of think they came up with themselves, which everyone's like, that doesn't make any sense. And then like, well, we should take them over and uplift them because they're still not as great as we are, but they're pretty impressive, but like whatever, they're monkeys. And they're like, no, we can't because they've put monkeys in space. So technically by our own rules, they've uplifted. So we're not allowed. So like, I've seen that a lot and that's written by a guy who made The Postman and he works for NASA and the Defense Department. And he does a lot of other stuff, but like, if you remember The Postman, it's this post-apocalyptic thing. So he's the new Arthur C. Clarke. And I think that it's a metaphor for what that historically has happened. And I don't know if 100,000 years is the right amount of time exactly, or how literal it is, or how colonial it is. But it seems like it's 100 years, maybe instead of 100,000 years or something. They take over Hong Kong for 500 years, 1,000 years, 100,000 years, whatever it is, and they in exchange for what they think they're doing, which is this Havelockian uplift, like giving the Greeks technology, then they owe them bondage for like a long time. I think that might be what slavery is like indentured servitude,
That's crazy. I've never even taken my mind there too, but man, that's crazy to even think. Yeah.
Right? Like, cause if you think about where dolphins are headed in terms of being used by the CIA also, like it's pretty creepy because they use them for echolocation in multidimensional circumstances. Like, for CERN now, it's becoming a more budgeted thing to use dolphin echolocation for like in DMT with dolphins. So I mean, so like the science in using them the way trackers used eagles 1,000 years ago it's just a logical progression from like eagle to airport dog to DMT dolphin, really.
Yeah, you keep finding too that like every time they just take so many steps forward technologically, they keep finding a way that the organic is going to supersede it always, right? That's always a really super interesting thing, is that you find that like this kind of social engineering of Hollywood is that the idea is that you have to blend the two, that you can't be too dominant, AI, that it's a blending of the two. And I really struggle with the whole idea of like pure AI, that it's obviously has to be a blending. This is again going to go a slippery slope with the egregore stuff, because I've always been fascinated with steampunk and that whole concept. And a writer that I really love brought up the concept of what if the steampunk was just a way of blending, as we're saying right now, the metaphysical or the extra dimensional egregore into a physical machine or organic machine. And this makes me think of your dolphin stuff too, is that maybe they found some way of doing this biologically, creating these organic vessels, or vessels that are already here, and shoving these egregores into them. And
has anybody said vapor punk yet? Is that I think it's time, vapor punk.
Yeah, it's just so interesting, because it just takes you so many places. The mind is an interesting thing. And I've talked to you a little bit about the dolphin and the bicameral mind, and how interesting of a subject that really is, and what they're really capable of. And just the whales in general uh, aquatic life, whales, dolphins, all of these things, and how their brain is developed and how it's shaped, and how the bicameral thing doesn't even exist there. So it really makes you think, again, echolocation. And
so the weirdest thought I've had, well, I can't take credit for this, actually Brittany thought this, but it actually makes sense, is that because they're kind of pretty much they can't smell very well, but their blowhole is like in the third eye location. Yeah. And so I think it's kind of like it has the senses out of their blowhole that's allowing them for a third eye kind of experience.
I agree. Yeah, you just think of it from an alchemical standpoint, the concept of man, on his feet, walking through this arid existence, but then you have an animal off its feet swimming through a watery world, just the allegory of that movie too, Waterworld, for instance. It ties in with a lot of the stuff we've talked about. And I keep telling this to people, especially a lot of our friends on Discord, that I keep finding more and more reason to go back and filter through some of these old Hollywood films, because gosh, it's just like it's almost like we have stepped into a different dimension, and now these movies are completely different than they were, or our way of looking at them is completely different, especially when it comes to CERN, for example, and the fact
right.
I've never heard that they were using echolocation or the dolphin was in any part of that. My stance on it is pretty different than a lot of people. I just think it's similar to the gridding and the takeover of mounds, and CERN's location. My little farm that I had out in the country that I just moved from was in a small town called Helvetia. And it was founded by Moorish Germans. And that just takes me again to Celtic lands, to New Helvetia. And this is where CERN is. And Cernunnos, and Shiva, and all these invocations that they're doing. And I feel like the narrative of them opening some kind of, Tartarus-based gate to let out these demons from this Saturnian prison. I don't know. It's a slippery slope for me, but it ties a lot of things together. So it's just, you find yourself like not knowing where to take it. The organic stuff with AI, though, is incredibly. I'm excited to see what you're going to show me.
I was going to pull it up because I just had that thought really quickly. Was that you saw that CERN said that they admit to see contact with a parallel dimension the other day.
Yeah.
They were talking
absolutely
about this. And so they're
well, John Dee and the D-Wave computer and the Black Monolith. I mean, we could go all day, but
well, my first thought was Super Mario Brothers, the movie, because if you remember the movie, which like everyone hated, you've got.
I loved it.
It is really amazing, but for the most part,
theaters like 6 times.
For the most part, there's some things about it that really stick out. Like for instance, like Mario wears often, only at the very end of the movie it's fixed, but the beginning he wears green, and like Mario wears green and Luigi wears red. It's like flipped at first, and it's almost never correct until the end of the movie. But the other thing is that the bad guy, Dennis Hopper, is sort of this Koopa's this Trump-like figure. He's got this blonde, kind of like, and there's posters. This is like the poster environmentalists. I wish I could find that, like, vote Koopa. I don't know, the propaganda poster. I have to like look for it in the movie. But basically he has a tower. The Koopa Tower is like Trump Tower. And he has a dimension that's controlled with like fungus, and he's very afraid of disease. So he's constantly like Trump is afraid of touching people's hands, apparently, and always has been. Like, this guy doesn't want to touch anyone's hands because he's afraid they're going to get fungus, and he's always wiping off things because he doesn't want to get fungus on it. Because it's between the reptilian world dimension and the simian world dimension where Mario is from, it gets very dirty. So he is very afraid of this disease that's destroying their civilization at the very end of it. And simultaneously, he's trying to bond the two dimensions together, which ends up in this freaky scene where Mario and Koopa end up disappearing into each other. Like they fade out of reality.
Yeah, that weird machine he has. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're turning into like pixels that start mixing together. Yeah, and Yoshi's freaking awesome. I mean, if you think about it. But that was, I mean, wow, dude, it's okay. I thought I closed something important. All right, cool.
Well, just the cover too, the M with how they're standing, which you could take this again to just a simple flipping of, ball, and you got the double V's, and yeah. For me, I hear Koopa and I think Kubla, which, I've read just about every book I could get my hands on that subject, and it ties in, I think, with a lot of what was going on here.
Oh, that is interesting because it's like two A's. Like, that's kind of ABBA thing.
Double V inverted too with the legs down, right?
Mm-hmm.
Jupiter's the feet, right? Go all day with inversions here, but yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely some weird stuff with the princess narrative in that one.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. For sure. I mean, you could go with, this is in so many films, this princess narrative and the Star Wars, same.
Well, I wish it showed the right pictures because, like, the lady from that movie who is the bad guy, like, I might just have to use Google. The lady from this movie who's the bad guy is like Maxwell, like totally.
Really?
Yeah. So you've got this group of girls that are kidnapped, and she's one of them, and they're trying to figure out which one is actually the reptilian princess lady. What is it? This lady right here. She's she's going around and she's collecting the girls for Koopa, and she works. She's constantly afraid of Koopa, and she does exactly as Koopa says. And he's making them take, machines to devolve and evolve when he wants them to. And she's just, she doesn't want him to be upset at her. And she just does exactly what he said. But she's trying to get power also and control the dimension, which ends up destroying her. So it seems like
the fungus narrative is so incredible. The
mycelium king.
Yeah, and fungi are under the husbandry of Saturn, and all time-inducing, psychotropic, whatever you want to describe them as, generally are related to this same thing. And you can tie it back to so many fundamental bases of religion, and it just becomes so slippery. It's like, is it the demonic realm? It's interesting. Mushrooms are crazy, the largest living organism. They distribute water to trees. They distribute nutrients all across the forest. It's incredible. Here in Oregon, my home state, we have the largest mushroom in the world, and it's an absolute monster. It's like 18 feet tall, weighs like 8,000 pounds, and they estimate that I can't remember the name of the word, but its structure underground goes for hundreds and hundreds of miles. I mean, is there a larger organic thing on Earth than fungi? I don't know. I think there's so much we don't know about fungus. Or if we do.
I'll never be able to look at the Pope painting again the same way, because it's just, now I'll always just see the mushroom is what, the Pope is the mushroom. And so, I mean, a lot of paintings are, but
it's like the parasite. How far do you take it, and what is it?
Yeah,
you know what I mean.
Well, do you want to let's zoom in a little bit closer on this article?
Okay, 1 second. This is the same one that we discussed earlier, but I think it was important to give a little more of the actual details of the article. Okay, so this is talking about the largest foundling asylum in the world. This is the same article we discussed earlier with Kathleen. Gamblers pay for it. Okay, so it was financed by a tax on cards.
Oh, this is the Russian one.
Yeah, and I guess what I really wanted to bring up was just this. This is what a Russian nurse looked like, and I know that this is going to be pretty interesting. Just look at the garb. You know, you look at the
Tartarian clothes from Slavic culture. Really,
100%.
Pre 19th, 20th century clothes that you wouldn't normally wear anymore. It's like Cossack robes.
Absolutely, and it goes on to describe that they have the best nurses in the world. So it's like it's weird. It's phrased like an advertisement, and they're open about it, right? They're trying to. I don't know if they're like trying to draw more of this in, but I just thought I wanted to show you that because I just thought that's exactly what popped out to me is they have the best nurses in the world. It's like what? And it going back to what you said about the Masons are the ones taking the babies. Like,
well, also the Jesuits, right? So here's
right. Yeah, of course.
They've forever
one degree of separation, right?
The Jesuits had a full-on legitimacy deal because it was like, give us your children and we'll give you men. Because then what happens is they've been raised by the church and they have all these altar boys that are soldier priests. They're warriors, like the Jedi. They basically are the Jedi. Absolutely. And but that doesn't mean the Jedi are the good guys. But whatever.
Hey, I'm all about the Scythians, the Sith. Me and Victor have talked about how Star Wars is a inverted story.
Taking people's kids away from them and making them never allowed to love anyone sounds pretty monarch. Yeah, it's like it's very specific.
And they're called the rebellion, and it's like we've heard that phrase too often to not raise an eyebrow. But it's amazing how easily they slip that under the radar.
It's true.
Totally. Yeah, the Scythian-Sith relation and the viceroys of Moscow and Europe. I mean, that's super interesting. And how
they let people take kids legally, and then they wouldn't be allowed to anymore. So then the Freemasons set up this thing. But before that, everyone were, so the Echo the Dolphin again. Everything comes back to everything. The creator Ed Annunziata, his name Annunziata, is that because there's a volcano mountain in Italy that people worship this goddess in this volcano. And then eventually the volcano would erupt and they would, feed it babies. And so for 1,000 years after that, when it became Catholic, instead, people would take their unwanted babies and then they would put it in a dumpster machine. And when the door opened, it would close on the other side. But when it closed on their side, it opened into the church. And so they would just take the babies out like a nice. And so anyone who went through there just got the name Annunziata. So we have like all of the Annunziata foundlings, which is, another example of similar, like taking over that system that was completely legitimized taking people's children. And also them having them abducted because, they would go to the hospital often and then they would say you're not fit to have the baby or whatever. I mean, we're not even sure how it goes every generation because at some points they would just take them from you because they were having them in their homes,
Definitely. And the language that was really interesting on that Uncle Sam one that we were talking about earlier kind of alluded to this, right, when they were mentioning food. And I have read in the past, but don't have an article to make it too relevant now, that they were doing the same thing, that breastfeeding mothers were having their children taken from them, and that breastfeeding was a sign of child abuse. And to see that becoming a topic of discussion now as a narrative is really scary because it seems like we're again getting ready to repeat a cycle. People keep talking about a reset, financial or whatever. And then you keep seeing these, again, for catchphrases that are coming up from these old articles from the 1800s, 1880s through the 1920s. It just, again, it's the time thing, right? The time pinch is super interesting. And it's weird. It's weird. So this one here.
Dolly and Bobby. Minneapolis. Minneapolis, man. The Minneapolis. It's a weird place, I'll tell you.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. That whole area, man. My mother lived in Wisconsin, and she just said it was one of the weirdest places. She was born and raised in the South, and she said that was weird. So that always stuck with me.
I feel like it'd be awesome to live in Wisconsin as long as you weren't like born in Wisconsin, because and vice versa with Minnesota, because they have like a rivalry. So everything is great when you're not from a place because there's no rivalry, you know?
Yeah, you
Like,
don't have any stake in the game. You just kind of get to watch it, stand back and watch. So true. I mean, rivalries are just, again, this takes us to segregations of society and sports and how all of these things are really being used to create this, again, this dystopia, really, so interesting. It makes you think Francis Bacon and the New Atlantis, and that these things to me more and more seem like some kind of spell.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a rhyme is such a great example, right? And abracadabra, if you say it, it becomes something, right? Or if what you say will become made or something, like realized. Rhyme often has this kind of conjurative power in terms of its geometrical symmetry. So just looking at like Dolly Drake and Bobby Blake, like I already feel like they're leading you, because when an adult is making a book for kids and it's full of rhymes, like, I don't know. You gotta wonder about that guy.
Yeah, and any time that I've come across some kind of historical figure, they often talk about the power of poetry and rhyme. And I'm sure you can reference this too, that when you get into, um, the sober mind, CIA culture, this is also another form of coded messaging, right? Or from a magical standpoint, a way of kind of implementing or impressing some kind of traumatic catchphrase that maybe has to do with a past life. I don't really know, but how I keep coming across these things and going to you and the dolphin is for an example. It's like, how could you not feel like some of these, the time is kind of irrelative, but it isn't. It just sends you on a trip, and rhyme and all of these things, like you said, this goes into like quantum language. Have you heard about that much? That's becoming like a catchphrase lately, but it just has to do with, like, from my perspective, the concept that pen is mightier than the sword, and think of what you're saying before you speak, because your words carry energy, right? And this goes to the manipulation of language. And you find these Aboriginal cultures, when they get conquered by somebody, the first thing that goes is a third of the alphabet, right? We got to get rid of this.
One time I wrote in like school, like the pen is mightier. I missed the space. It was like the penis mightier than the sword. And my teacher thought it was just, she's like, good job. I was like, what? I was like, what? Okay. I meant to do that. Okay.
It makes you think, though, just the way that our language is organized and how we interact with each other on the day to day, what we say to each other, just the standard greetings, hello, good morning. Like, people just say these things without ever even really asking themselves, why is that how we greet each other? Oh, hell,
Yeah.
You got the devil written right there just in your greeting. And the work week, and just the establishment of that you're a slave on the mind, the words you're speaking, it's crazy. And I think rhyme has a lot to do with that.
Isn't it funny? Because everyone's like, why do you say hello? I'm like, well, because we used to say hallowed, like hallowed be thy name. Well, but that's not why we say it. That's not why we used to do. We didn't. No. Why do we say hell now? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the thing, is you'll almost find yourself defending something that you don't even understand yourself. It's crazy. But yeah, back to the excerpt.
For sure.
This one's you can read between the lines here. If you need me to zoom in, I can do more.
Yeah, some zoom a bit. Is that a stork?
This is a stork. Yeah, they're pointing to the sky. Okay, stork lands. Okay, flying high overhead was a big bird.
Know what time it is. Time for a baby.
Yeah. Howdy do, said the stork. Basically, it goes on in here to describe this story of these children.
Is it legible? Can you zoom in enough that we can read that?
I can find the original article, which I'll try to do when we get caught up in a conversation. But you can see here, basically, going back to that first article describing the baby as a flower. This has also been used a lot by in these emails, and the flower is often a term for babies. And big sign on the gate, right in the hearts of the flowers. You have babies growing in the flowers. They're like nurturing the babies in these flowers here, right? And then this is like the Cabbage Patch Kid reference, which there's some pretty good stuff out there that people have pointed out a lot of weird stuff. And the Cabbage Patch Babies, they had their own cards that were super weird. And the advertisements and commercials, I'm sure that was probably a little bit before. No, we're pretty similar in age. Do you remember any of those commercials or when those were popular? They had the
Which ones?
Cabbage Patch Kids. They had Cabbage Patch Kids. They had Cabbage Patch Babies.
I remember
they had Garbage Babies, which was really, really weird. And it touched on a lot of what we're saying, but in a weird way where they were just throwing children away, essentially. And
so I know the story of like how parents were tricked into wanting this thing there was too little of, and people were breaking into windows and smashing and killing each other and robbing each other like in parking lots at night.
Yeah, it's like the Tickle Me Elmo thing, but the foundations of it.
Yeah, but I don't think I actually saw the commercial. I also remember the dolls were very creepy faced. Yeah, like
absolutely. Anyways, you got over here you have little black babies, big growing in flowers. Yeah. And basically, from what I'm reading here, is you get your pick. And in the center here, it basically goes on to say the same thing. It's like a children's tale.
Are those flowers basically, as I look at them more, they're vaginas, right? Like basically.
Yeah, that's what I'm seeing as well. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it's like read between the lines, essentially. Why do we have little kids going around and the stork's, the stork's not delivering the children, but they're going and picking the children out of the ground. Again, I think this is like what we were hearing in the other article, that I think hundreds of thousands of kids were either being raised here, from other countries, like you were describing, wanting a certain type of race in a certain area. I think that's like your first red flag to the migration of a bunch of orphans into an area. And again, tying this in with resets and the repopulating and rebuilding of America, the train stuff, like you were saying, with the roads going into Stockton, how these narratives follow the gold rush, and why call it slavery when you can call it migration? Because then textually it seems like you just have all these people voluntarily chasing the American dream, or whatever you want to call it. Gets very, very dark. Some of them I'm just not going to display because it comes up with a lot of actual figures and what they were doing. We came across several articles that talk about money, where I would say that the person wasn't high enough up or a part of enough of a big enough group to have everything, swept under the rug. But she was selling babies to everybody. Politicians, whatever. And I'm sure they weren't raising these children. And this is an article from the 1920s, and she was charging $1,000. That's what she was being paid. So, read between the lines, 1920. That sounds like money for what the nasty stuff we're hearing about.
Yeah. Today. If 1920, you said, so that's about the price of a car.
Yeah.
So that it works out.
Yeah.
Like a Ford.
Yeah.
It's pretty serious.
And again, the narratives, again, with foundings, trains, slave labor, you hear a lot of the building of the West, built on the back of, Chinese and some natives and some Spanish. But I'm more and more feeling like when you do find some of those juicy pictures, like some of the water blasting in California, you've seen those pictures. There's a lot of kids. It's a lot of kids, and that's like they're the ones that are doing the real dirty work. Where too many people would be raising eyebrows, like, "What are we? We're finding a stone structure. Like, 150 feet down, and we're blasting out these huge canyons with these water cannons. For what reason? We're told that it's to mine, but I just don't believe that for a second.
So, I mean, do you think then, like, looking at how far back this goes and how deep this infrastructure is for this, do you think that we are able to find patterns in the same places that have been going on? Like, if something's been going on, not just in 2008, let's say in Omaha, but it's been going on forever. Like Lincoln Park is apparently an example where.
Yeah, you brought that up. Fabulous. Can you go into that a little more?
Yeah, and well, I mean, there's only so much that I could show. Let me see if I can find a good article to help with that. But Lincoln Park is a band, and they've talked about the actual park, Lincoln Park, where hold on, let me get this thing popped up. So Lincoln Park, Chicago, is right. Is that correct? I think that's the thing.
Yeah.
Is the place where people hang out. It's a community neighborhood. There's been all these Tartarian houses, etc. But it's also a place where there's been kidnappings, rapists that get away with it, kids that disappear, a lot of poverty, and there was a lot of prostitution. And from prostitution into child prostitution and teenage male prostitution. And so there's been a number of alleged stories about the members of the band even being connected to Podesta. Like there's a lot. There's a movie actually, Mysterious Skin, which is about this. It's pretty nuts, but it's got what's his name, Joseph Gordon-Levitt as a male prostitute, essentially, like a high school kid who's exploited because he was molested by his baseball coach. And this kid thinks that he was abducted by aliens because he was molested. So, the movie kind of goes into a lot of that whole how they get a kid to think that it's okay what's happening to them, and they become completely insane and have trauma.
Isn't that so funny that, have you ever read anything about a lot of these UFO sightings where you do have a lot of people that have been abused, and this just brings back the disassociation MK relation? You know what I mean?
That tends to be what I think most of the time they want people to think. Also, I mean, I think it's true. Like for the most part, it is just that they convince people in hypnosis that it's like something other than their own face. But at the same time, also after the 80s, it's like it became more and more about sensationalizing and making any idea of something that's not believable go away. Like the closer we're getting to this time that they were telling us space would be here and there would be aliens and all this stuff, the further and further away that the concept is becoming socially acceptable.
Yeah. It's so interesting. And you'd use the word hypnosis, which to me is so interesting because have you ever read any Edgar Cayce?
Edgar Cayce. Remind me. Hold on.
I mean, he was a famous seer, whatever you want to call him.
Oh, right, the clairvoyant. Just in like research around it, Atlantis.
He had talked about this too, that it's kind of like the idea of these people that are really susceptible to being hypnotized, and how much they are related to these subjects of all of these things: the military, Hollywood, UFOs. It's like you're finding the same soft, easily manipulated, malleable person who often has some historical background of abuse. I don't know. I just think it's so important. Again, this ties in with the egregore and
oh man. So this is my dad told me this story as a kid, and I'll never forget it. It was the one where he memorized the Bible. And that's how he became so famous, really, was because his capacity to memorize the Bible freaked so many people out. They were like, okay, like, let's listen to him. So his photographic memory was, I think, a big part of it. And the fact that his parents, like, disciplined him into doing that. But he was capable.
Yeah, yeah. The photographic memory thing is super interesting too because it does have some dissociative principles based on it. You know, it's like the mind palace, which I keep. It's so funny. I keep talking about this. They're also relative, you know, and the mind palace is more of like a self-controlled version of a disassociative type personality, right? That you have these different versions of yourself that are really just storing different experiences, and your inability to kind of mesh those together is what's going to create these experiences, or however you want to describe them. And that's where these, you know, shady people, shady governments get involved, and they almost always can find the person who is really easily susceptible to these types of things. It's almost always hypnosis, and that's what Edgar Cayce would talk about.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the time in the old days, people looked at things as hypnosis before they understood how to have neurolinguistic conversations.
For
In the
sure.
old days, it was, and the thing is, even at this point, he's saying there are people that if they want it to work, we can work together and it'll be very functional.
Yeah.
There's circumstances where you can trick people into things, and that's not exactly his major focus. It's more that, like, if you want, you can actually make use of this, you know. And I think that's what neurolinguistic programming is, because when you have a conversation and both parties are aware of language and symbols and the structure of cadence and tones and everything, that you're basically having it's like two rays of light pushing against each other, you know. Like it makes hypnosis not the same, but it's also useful still, because then you can work together.
Yeah. I finally found my original here. So we're gonna go back, and I can read that center section really quick, and then I'll go back to that article. Because it is important.
Clear as day.
Yeah, big long-legged birds sailing through the air attracted the attention of Dolly Drake and Bobby Blake. One fine morning in Storyland. Hello there, Mr. Stork, called Bobby boldly. The stork looked down at them inquiringly, and then sailed slowly and majestically towards the spot where they were standing. Good morrow to you, Dolly Drake. Good morrow to you, Bobby Blake, said the stork. Storks always do speak so quaintly. Like, right there's a red flag to me. Stood out. Then he continued, if you are quiet and do no harm, I'll take you to my baby farm. You may be sure, yeah, you may be sure Dolly and Bobby promised to be the very best children that ever were. And they followed the stork, and they tried to copy his slow and dignified walk. And that, to me, again, is kind of a red flag. That makes me just think Jesuit. Pretty soon they came to a small hedge covered with milky white blossoms. Also a red flag. Over the entrance was a sign, the Stork Company Baby Farm. Dolly and Bobby saw rows and rows of blooming plants like a flower and vegetable garden combined, but no babies. But when Dolly looked closer into the heart of a monster rose, there was the dearest little babykins fast asleep. Bobby looked into the cabbage heads, and there in every one was a tweeny weeny baby. That's where we keep the commoner kind. We find them easier to find, explained the stork. Over by the hedge stood a row of big sunflowers, and that's the black babies.
That's fucked up.
And
I
in
can't
the
even believe
center
that.
of each, a cunning little colored baby sleeping peacefully. Dolly and Bobby forgot all about keeping quiet and danced and clapped their little hands. All the babies awoke and commenced to cry lustily, and then such a racket. Father Stork flapped his wings angrily, and what happened next, you shall learn next Sunday. I chased to find more of it, and I couldn't find anything else. So,
my God. Well, so can you kind of revisit that bit again, Gazumekin? Actually, I wanted to look at the part where he says commoner kind. I wanted the context of that again.
sure.
So the baby looked into the cabbage heads, and there in everyone was a tweeny weeny baby. So tweenie already seems kind of weird. Something about that. It's just almost like I almost hear teen, but like it's in between, like the tweens. But all right, whatever.
Yeah.
And then that's where we keep the commoner kind, and then you start talking about black babies. So, well,
yeah, this is like your Moorish native inversion again. Like the foundations of America for me are based not always on that, but a lot of it on more of the Saturnian darker skinned races. And then you find, again, that's just such a catchy phrase. And before I even read that, you look down here.
Yeah, and the end of it was straight. Well, yeah, there's 3 different kinds of faces. It's like it's one's sleepy, sad, and happy, or I don't know if it's sleepy or
sleepy.
Dead.
Sleepy, I don't know, happy. I have no idea, but this is a lot
sleepy, sad, and satisfied. We could do all kinds of things, but also their clothes once they become adopted or whatever. Maybe I don't know. Like the clothes they're wearing, is it just me or like because the kids have straightened hair?
Yeah.
Like so, they've been anglified.
Exactly.
Anglifiled, I think our Nation of Islam friends would say.
Yeah, whitewashing, big time for sure. However you want to look at that, of course. The ideas of race and skin color is so interesting beyond just surface level stuff.
I mean, a lot of it is like, I hate to say it, but classism for the specific period that things are happening. But it is interesting how, each time period tries to represent their opposition to their class by, how they dress or, what outfit what they do with their hair, especially.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I didn't even notice that. So again, why it's so important to share these things.
I mean, have you seen Malcolm X? Like where he had to bleach his hair and stuff, and it like burns his scalp because he ran out of water. I mean, that's rough. Like I wouldn't want to do that.
No, this was just such an insane time period, and the more you dive into it, you keep finding holes in a lot of it for sure. This right here is absolutely insane that these are even newspaper articles. I mean, they're rare, obviously, because out of I don't even know quite a few 100,000 pages of newspaper articles. There's probably only 60 or so in this type of a framework, and the pictured ones are even more rare. There's probably only 3 or 4 like this. I wish I could have found part 2 of this, But I have a feeling that there wasn't going to be a part 2, just by the way this is phrased, And what happened next, you shall learn next Sunday. It's like, this is a comic strip, Jeez Louise.
I'm going to pull up this picture, actually, of the orphan train thing. I was trying to find a good orphan train, maybe newspaper article would be helpful. But, very common at this time, and some of you have seen this already, wanted homes for children. So it's not just that they were, taking people's kids. Like it was when they took them, they took so many kids, they actually had to put them places. Yeah. And I think that's kind of weird. Like we're told this kind of different narrative, really, but we're seeing it more and more, how many foundlings there were and how many sterile adults there were. That's another side of it. That's kind of interesting. How many people couldn't have kids and they had farms and they needed kids. So they would have a train stop in their town and drop off, and you pick up a bunch of kids and bring them back to your house.
Yeah. Super interesting actual part of my life that I can share about that is when I was doing my ancestry, I found out that my great grandfather on my mother's side had 12 kids, and my mother had no clue. She never heard of that. Whoa. She never knew that. And when we went through some of the census information, she's just like, this can't be real, or it's not the same person. And so funny you bring that up, because they had an absolutely massive farm in northern Georgia, and they lost like 4 kids. And it makes me think that, this could have easily been one of those scenarios, 12 kids, this time period, huge farm, post post a period where most plantation owners were Moorish men, and the farm as we know it is not exactly what is described to. The whole idea of the plantation is not at all the narrative that's portrayed. Anyway, so that concept has popped through my mind more than once, that perhaps they just adopted these kids. That's kind of what my mom was like. There's no way that they had 12 kids. He had 12 kids and he was in his 30s. Like, that's not even possible. It's either the census information's wrong or the train stopped in the town. I think that's a more common narrative than we think. Again, this goes with the gritty.
250,000 homeless and poverty-stricken children, thousands who've been living in the streets of New York City, given a Bible and a new set of clothes, loaded on rail cars, and transported west on the trains to be taken in by families who promise to care for them. So, I mean, people go to New York, the kids disappear, and then there's now people living all over the country that
places. Like we talked about with the gridding system of basically the whole flyover states from the Rocky Mountains east. And for anyone that doesn't know what I'm talking about, just go on Google Earth and just look at the eastern part of America, the plains. It's all agriculture, and it's perfectly divided segmentations of land that are. It's unprovable to know how old they are, but you can see some of the scarring of the river basins, right? Those electro types of scarring, space in the actual name of what it is. But have you seen that before? Do you know what I'm talking about, Andreas?
Yeah, the kind of Martian river scarring that shows that it's been used for hydroelectric, or it could actually just be like natural flows. There's all kinds of excuses for it. But a lot of the time, like you look at like the American River in California, and it's natural now, but at one point what happened was they blew up places, and so the water now has to change the path that's been made by it changing. It could have been from earthquakes but it wasn't. That was from explosions and from the gold rush. So I mean, but then it leaves us is that what you're
I'm in my opinion that the gridding came before this type of electrical scarring that created a lot of these massive river basins, mostly like Panhandle, Texas, more towards New Mexico. You can see it clear as day. More of the desert areas, you can see it too, closer to Utah. But you can see the grid is pre this scarring. And I think this, again, ties in with the narrative of repopulating these plains states. And this agricultural boom essentially was organized and on a scale that cannot be described other than otherworldly. I don't even know if that's the right word for it, but it's certainly not something that we're capable of in the paradigm that we live in today.
Let me really quickly look at this, and then we'll go to your slide. I just wanted to quickly check on this article on infertility in 1909. And there's a number of cited sources, but it really is it's interesting because you start noticing that this is when, I guess, the early 20th century, late 1800s, male infertility studies start happening a lot. Also female ones. I just mean to say, though, that here's a record of the male ones, but that's a lot of male and infertility studies happening at once. What's going on? How come there's that many studies going on that they have male ones and female ones, and there's so many different people working on it, and it wasn't like that in the 1600s. All of a sudden, we've got this really big push to find out why so many people are unable to have kids. And yet the answers are still kind of fuzzy.
Yeah. What do you think? What's your personal opinion? Do you feel like this is, again, eugenics or?
Yeah, I do. I mean, well, you look at the different diseases that people had, and then they told you that they had to get vaccinated because those were the diseases that were going to stop you from having kids. So
Same
who
narrative
knows?
of today, right?
Yeah, well, it's the beginning of it probably, or maybe it goes back further. But you've got mumps. You've got mumps is one that if kids get mumps, then they can't have kids maybe after 13 or something. Like I've heard that was in
Really?
Postman. I'm sorry, I think it's second reference to that. But
Oh, hey,
he
I'm
has
glad you
7
said it
kids,
because that ties in with the orphans too, because the post service was delivering babies for
right?
like 20 plus years, openly.
Well, they
So
still
what is
delivered bees.
yeah, I mean, gosh, that postman thing is super interesting. Just the post service in general, right? And the buildings that they occupied, in the late 1800s. It's like, what's really going on here?
Totally. Well, I mean, again, so I guess now we can look at this Rich Fathers of Nameless Kids article, or whatever it is from the daybook. An
Yeah,
Adless newspaper. Oh, okay. So Adless was the guy who, what's that called? Life with Father. His father, I think. Adless. He had
really.
his own. Yeah.
What a funny relation. Yeah, rich fathers of nameless kids sought in baby farm probe. Blah, blah, blah. State investigator hurries to Springfield with a report on baby farming promises sensational exposure. Oak Park case in court. Again, Oak Park. This is probably the sixth or seventh baby farm I've come across that's been related to a park with the name Oak. So that's interesting and weird considering I've done a lot of breakdowns about Hercules and the oak tree and Jupiter. So that's a red flag. And what parks are for the most part. I mean, they are snatch and grab places, and generally parks are part of covering old mountain complexes. I mean, I'm not saying every park is like that, but I would say a golf course named Oak or a park named Oak, something is something to pay attention to.
I remember there was like for a while, a bunch of people had these yellow ribbons on their cars for soldiers, I
Yeah,
think it was, and that was
yeah, yeah.
pink ones. But the first time I saw it, I didn't know it was a ribbon. I saw it was put on the car like magnetic, and it was like
Uh-huh.
at enough of an angle, it looked like an ankh or something,
Yeah,
kind of. So I was
yeah,
like,
or the fish. Yeah.
what's up with this Egyptian looking occult symbol in everybody's car? I was like 10, I literally had no idea it was what it's supposed to be. But there's that song, tie a yellow ribbon around the old oak tree. And now I wonder also about, oak trees die, they get rot, they're basically only good for burning because they grow so quickly and you can burn them. Like that's I don't know, maybe other people love them more than I do, but that's
No, I
basically
mean that's great. As a symbol, they're like I said, they tie in a lot of this stuff, and I think they're markers for a lot of shady stuff symbolically. Anyways, it is believed some of these farmers are working in league with shady doctors who attend unmarried mothers. Again, the unmarried mothers thing to me is a cover up. It is known that the keepers of these farms shake down mothers. So I think this ties in with what we were alluding to earlier about um, how easy it was for them to take children away from people, and that the narrative of breastfeeding was child abuse, and that they had this whole like because in a lot of these articles too, you'll hear they were feeding the child milk and it wasn't even boiled, and this concept of pasteurization. I mean, when did that really become a forced requirement? I mean, because these articles mostly are from 1860 through 1920, and talking about pasteurization. So that to me is also a red flag. How many mothers were really feeding their kids formula? Like the narrative of breastfeeding and formula and all of these things it's it's so blurry, but it's obviously I think part of this control structure too. These farms shake down mothers, and then if trouble comes up, threaten exposure, and the girls are forced to keep silent. One important cleanup has been made by the arrest of Miss Lewis Kennedy, Lois. Um, Thanks again to some of our friends on on Discord because we chased this woman down, and she's related to oh gosh, I'm gonna forget his name. This is embarrassing, but he was one of these James Dunn, right? The Hollywood
James Dunn
director.
Ooh.
Who has been in a lot of hot water for comments he's made and things he's posted on his Twitter. It's obviously very coded child, interests. Anyways, this Lois Kennedy, she is a Kennedy, and she is related to the Gunn family, and it is. That's why I'm sharing this one, because the names, connects a lot of these families. Like I was saying, that these people of prominence, they could get a kid like nothing, and no one asked a question where it went. I mean,
and also, this religious thing is interesting, religious objection, because so much of this is people say, they're like, oh, well, people cared if they were married or not. It's like, wait, like the Catholic Church kind of forced people to get married for about 500 years, maybe. Like, but it's only if you count the last 100 years. And at the time, we were talking about 100 years prior. So, I mean, it's really, you're saying that for a very short, granted, a couple generations or 4 generations or something like that, there's marriage is a big deal to some of these people, but not to all of them. And, like the different cultures all of a sudden not having support networks, like other than to just give your baby to the Catholic nuns or to the nurses or the hospital or the community center. I mean, it just seems a little beyond the pale, but maybe.
Yeah. I don't buy it either. I mean, again, you have to be open to anything with these types of things, and certainly anything's possible. And I'd be ready to read tomorrow that, all of this was nonsense. But it seems to me, again, going by the numbers we were talking about, and just the stories of foundling orphanages in Italy and France and Germany, the numbers, I mean, shit, there were thousands in Italy. I mean, how is that even possible? What was really going on? And I think that they weren't just repeopling America. Again, it just ties in with the reset, that they were these underground networks has to be the only other explanation, or that the places that weren't part of this targeted system. I don't know. I mean, what's your take on it?
Well, okay. Another weird thing that it makes me think, the Catholic Church has always been so against abortion. And even now, so when we're talking about, is Planned Parenthood, stem cells, is that being used by the Catholic Church? Even when it comes to their genetic research, they deviate from using that kind of thing. You'll still use stem cell from umbilical cord and things in their research. But so that gives you kind of an idea ideologically how they feel. Whereas, a lot of other people are totally okay with it. And so that's kind of an interesting thing to consider about it. Like the Talmudic law is not the same as all Jewish law. So for the most part, Jews are supposed to be against it too, but there's like a sect that's okay with it. But for the most part,
that was part of the whole trauma of World War II, that now the Torah Jew is because they're lumped as all Jews, that it's like it's frowned upon to even say that the Talmud is not at all what the majority of us are interested in or have anything to do with. If you can get a real, I don't even know what real means anymore, but
that's the thing.
Yeah, you can get there. I've grown up with plenty of Jews, and not a single one of them spoke kindly of the Talmud. And they just said that because of history, that you just don't speak unkindly of anyone that's a Jew, that calls himself a Jew, which is insanity to me. But
there's also ways of looking at the Talmud that are kind of like outside of the paradigm of what we're looking at it to say. It's talking more about how you treat everyone as you're an Ubermensch, essentially. The Talmud's this Ubermensch manual, and you've got farm hands that are animals, but you treat them better than you would treat than a normal person would treat their farm animals, as far as you think you are. You've got this rigorous rule that you're following. So it starts you off on a pretty ideologically disassociated from humanity path, where you're saying
Absolutely.
that humans are in different grades already, and that you're at this like peak apex, superhuman level, God's chosen master race.
Absolutely.
That's the very specific side of it.
Yeah, and as a big study of the Old Testament, this just ties in so much with Moses, the Ten Commandments, the concepts of laws given to us by gods, and Jehovah. I mean,
yeah, following rules that you're supposed to follow, but they come out of the book of Ptahhotep's divine maxims, and there are only like a quarter of them, or just a little less than a quarter of them.
yeah.
So it's really weird, like that's supposed to be a full religion, but then all of society's laws are based on the 7 Noahide laws. But babies being allowed to be taken or treated differently, like for stem cell research and for abortion and everything. Like even the Catholic Church would take kids and teach them in college and like to put needles through the condoms of their dorm mates and stuff to give their dorm mates sperm a fighting chance, And
yeah,
so,
I've heard you say that before, and that's mind blowing to me.
Yeah, so it changes my understanding a bit about like stem cell research and Planned Parenthood, because I still have to figure out where it fits in their relationship if they're so gung ho about socially, saying, I mean, even there's infrastructure for it. Like there's Planned Parenthood's getting money. You can follow the money, but they're socially still saying everyone should have as many babies as possible. So,
yeah, I mean, again, eugenics and Planned Parenthood, and this takes us again back to what we were talking about earlier with the vaccines and forced sterilization. I mean, that's happening right now with who, Mr. Gates. And his father had this stuff down to a science, and it just makes me think more and more that you have the same power structure, basically running the same. I wouldn't even call it an experiment. It's not experiments anymore. I mean,
I like Baby Farm. Baby Farm. It's like the America's Shortest Shore is a baby farm. That sounds about right.
100%. I mean, I think that's why I wanted to start with that article, because I think that kind of is probably the main piece to focus on, because it really, like we said, the idea again of migrations and immigrants, I think that is a completely misused term that needs that alone just needs a lot of investigation, because so much of that historical narrative in that time frame is complete hogwash nonsense that can have all the kinds of holes poked through it. But at the same time, you're having these absolute massive migrations, at least on paper, Ellis Island. And I remember going to New York and, being fed all that bullshit about all of that. And look at all the names and flip through the book and blah, 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 blah. And it's like the peopling of America was 90% of this, I believe, orphan train. It's what I'm feeling, just because, again, of the things I brought up, how much stuff.
And we've seen the people in Russia, like that link. It's interesting because Canada has an article similarly, and I don't remember where it is now, but it showed similarly how many babies were being brought from Russia to America. Yeah. So the fact that they're bringing babies from Canada and America to Russia and Britain to Russia, and in Australia also, but they're also bringing babies from Russia to America and Canada. So they're just shifting people around a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It is. I think, again, I keep going back to the inversions of everything, that where you're from, the language you speak, the people you worship, that inside of this time frame, these, revisionist history things that we touch on so much with Tartarian, et cetera, they all tie in together. And this, again, brings our time frame of, I 380, would be as far back as I'd be willing to go in written history, and then we could also take this farther and talk more about the bicameral mind, pictographs, hieroglyphics, communication through symbols, psychic communication of symbols, and what that really means in a brain that is not bicameral. And just the story of Gilgamesh and these ancient stories where how they're actually presenting the narrative is like they're downloading the information while they're telling the story. And it's just incredible. And the Tower of Babel and how all of these things relate to each other is really interesting as well. But just language as a template, you can see so much manipulation there. And how far back can we take that? It kind of gets depressing because you keep finding the same method of control, which is almost always a direct inversion of what its aboriginal form was, in my opinion.
I'm going to pull up actually a couple pictures that you gave me a while ago. I still have from way back. Let's see here. This guy. So I like this, when you're talking about history at that period and what we have. We know that it starts with records of a high society, high civilization fallen apart. And that's basically where it starts. And it's very much like the what's that Cowboy Bebop, where like the internet has been destroyed, and like, well, we don't really know what happened before the internet, but when it crashed.
Yeah, you can see this. It's like the same narrative. You can see the same base for it all. Yeah, I mean, the opening of the Old Testament, as you're dealing with a pretty incredibly magically strong, rich, diverse, advanced civilization. It's like, how do we just take this massive jump and then it's all being destroyed? The idea of the vengeful God, and relating that again to so much of my astrological work and Jupiter and Saturn, and why it's so relative that we're talking about this stuff right now. We're moving into an absolutely energetically rich but also confusing time, and it ties right in with biblical history. Yeah, and you can see these, in my opinion, are devices to amplify your psychic ability, and that language, Hebraic especially, the way they leave, constants and all of these things, the ideas of quantum language and what that really means, and how language has completely devolved from this period of time, right, in the Tower of Babel. Whether or not that was a real thing doesn't matter. It's just the allegory of whatever the separation of people and language, right? This is a control mechanism. And we're still under that today. And you can see that it's been happening more and more. We've talked about the Bolsheviks, and you can see this with like every language, Ogham, the Celtic calendars. It's like,
yeah. And what was that guy, Alexander Dugin? Dugin?
The magician for, what's his name? Gosh, I can't believe I'm forgetting his name.
For Putin's guy.
Yeah, Putin's magician.
Putin's magician. Yeah, his Putin's Rasputin or something like that.
Putin's Rasputin. Yeah, this man, we've talked about him. His work
the political fourth theory. You had showed me that, and I thought that was really great.
Yeah. I mean, his idea, his wanting to revitalize the Aryan nation. What does that mean to this guy, right? I think it ties in with, Iran and what that represented pre the narrative we've been handed. And it's incredibly interesting. And he is a outspoken hater of Donald Trump. I mean, he wants him hung from the gallows. So it's interesting when you think that Putin, this guy's opinion weighs more than anybody's to Putin. And his geopolitical mindset is a interesting one, to say the least. Why don't you explain a little bit of some of that stuff, at least your opinion
Well,
of it.
I mean, so Eurasianism is sort of if you think of Reconstructionism in America after the Civil War, Eurasianism is the Bolshevik version. They have like this period where they've destroyed civilization, they've taken down all the cities, they've burned everything. It's just like it was in the South. All of it's gone. But then they're thinking that they should put it back together with people that they've brought on trains, usually from other places, usually in Southeast Asia. And when they get into further Russia, part of the ideological campaign is Eurasianism. And Eurasianism was that, Russia is not part of Europe. It's not part of Asia. It's really its own thing. But the only way to do that is to take away Russia, has to take away, Asia and Europe. And, at least part of it. And to do that, it has to be inclusive in those concepts at the same time, which means that, that they're part of the thing, but they're not at all necessarily obliged to be part of the thing. And it's a political maneuver that allowed them to be, whatever you say, but remember, I still have to deal with them, but never. So it's very like two-faced, but it didn't really work perfectly. And that's why China was like, no. And they kind of continue to take over more of Asia. And so Asia, or at least ideologically. And so Asia is going ideologically more like China than Russia at first. Now there's a neo-Eurasian movement. And so neo-Eurasian politics kind of is this idea that Russia has made Kazakhstan more historically. There's always been a relationship between nomadic Rus that were going on Scandinavian boats, and really that they control. If you look at the other thing is look at like a polar projection map for a second. Russia, can you see anyway, for the most part, Russia's, follows along this kind of thing that touches the America up to Western Europe, just far enough. And then this is China. So it's so much of the top of the world there that it poses itself to be the more valid European culture and the more valid Asian culture. That's a distinction I think people don't make, and it needs to be made, because that's the ethnic side of it that's kind of interesting or dangerous or provocative or whatever it is the idea that that the Chinese state of the PRC was created by Han, who moved in, and that the Korean Rus and that the Chinese up in the north, the Manchurians in the west, and the Mandarins, each group were subjugated, like the Uyghurs up in the far west here. They were forced to become this other state. And so Russia, this is oppositional to what history teaches. History teaches that Russia invaded these places with trains in the last 100 years and put these people there. But if you look at the ethnic evidence, there really is a lot of ethnic evidence of people living there simultaneously farther back than 100 years ago. So that doesn't really work. So Russia does have kind of this legitimacy. Simultaneously, France in Western Europe is, in Spain and all of Europe is far closer to Africa. And so their contingency is that Western Europe is really African, which is what Western Europe has kind of insinuated with their ideological actions with the EU, with what do they call it? Franco-Africa. France is, France is African. The way they say it is that Africa is French, but really it's the other way around. And I think that's, Spain, even except for North Spain, South Spain we got a lot of influences from Africa. We don't understand what that means as Americans, I think, because Africa is not, in the North, the same as Africa in the South.
Yeah, not at all.
So looking at Morocco and all these different places where culture is very different than it is in the Congo.
For sure.
People
the Berbers and the Basque and.
But they probably have legitimacy over Europe, and I think Europe acknowledges this. The German families, the black nobility, even
absolutely.
So, And it doesn't really end up being a skin color thing, because at the end of the day, if you have any blue-eyed DNA in you after generations, it can become the recessive gene. You can breed to be blonde, blue-eyed people, and
absolutely.
But vice versa, you can instantaneously change someone's skin color. So, like with another generation. So it's not. It ends up being
not what we're told.
Yeah, not nearly at all. I mean, if you've seen the new you saw the Rammstein music video about Germany.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you touched on France too, and this goes back to America, and you've seen a lot of my concepts of what the Q Celts and the P Celts, and just that idea is a linguistic tie. And man, that makes France really, really juicy, because the Susquehanna talk about the only salvation or a chance they had to fight off this evil purge was the French. And the depictions that I come across, they're all Moors. So all the French in America were Moors that were helping this Q Celtic Aboriginal. And again, the roots of Berber, Basque, you have that same linguistic root. I mean, it's incredibly interesting. And going back to what you just said here, I believe the exact same thing, that Western Europe was at its root, Moorish. I hate using that word, but darker skin.
I definitely think that there's multiple races existing at the same time. The Visigoths and the Cordoba Caliphate are interacting, and so that's one of the reasons why the French have not extremely necessarily one way or the other, because people are mixed. They're xenophiles. They're explorers.
Absolutely.
They don't just want to see nature. They want to have sex with nature. They want to go out and be like as close to something different as possible. They're not afraid. Like, otherwise they wouldn't get on the boat. So just psychologically, it makes sense that they would be they wouldn't be opposed to what they're seeing. And then there are people like that who have been conscripted and forced on boats, and then they get places that they're like, why aren't you like me? And they kill you. That's a very specific mission,
Yeah, it's amazing how it being your choice has such an effect on it, the methodology to it all. Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah, because again, you find the same thing with the Templars and the Sinclairs and Quebec and Canada. I mean, Canada was a country built on this principle that you're describing here. The Xenos were just perhaps running from exile or whatever, but they were more than happy to interbreed with these people and create these ancestral connections. And the Welsh are, Basque, all these people were intermarrying with, I don't want to say Aborigines, but the more native people of Americas, or the Americas in general. Peruvian too, as man, the history of Brazil and South America has been completely just whitewashed, because boy, it was not that at all. Again, as we go back to the Tartary concept, all people welcome and working together as one.
Here's a fun, I don't know. Happy Halloween, everybody. This is our Halloween special streams, I guess. We're doing all the dark stuff. I'm sorry. Smithsonian, California once targeted Latinas and forced sterilization. I found a number of these articles from different places near where I'm from, like Napa. This is, by the way, what Napa, California looked like in 1900. Napa is known for two things: being like the most terribly boring, like Fresno-esque place in the world, and for wine castles. There's just castles everywhere, of course. That makes sense. So, okay. But yeah, a lot of poverty and a lot of wealth, but they have a number of the people who lived at this time were sterilized. They were injected with things. I've seen a lot of ones about Basques, but the Latinas, of course, they were making sure that they couldn't have kids, and they didn't tell them that they were doing this. And they were pretty quick to make sure that people did not have children at the rates that they were before that. So you've got people that were having 12 kids go down to 1 kid or no kids at all. Or if they had a kid, they'd sterilize them. They come through the hospital, they'd sterilize them for sure. And there's a number of examples like that are more modern. I remember it's the Puerto Rico sterilization, Planned Parenthood. This one was a fun one where they sterilized 1/3 of the Puerto Rican youth. It was like girls.
1/3?
Yeah,
Shit.
at least the entire population of at least this area. Maybe it might be grizzly population is a part of the place, but they took out basically any woman who went through there, and it was nuts. Like they went and made sure that nobody was having babies, and anybody who had a baby was sterilized. Other people were given pills that made them sterile over a period of a year, or if you take it for like 6 months, it didn't, you wouldn't have. Yeah, and then they were giving forced hysterectomies to people. It was just super insanity. So you start
What do you
seeing
think about the sunspot cycle and its relation to sterilization?
Well, maybe actually you should go into that. And what is your take?
Well, man, it's hard because you see so much chemicals being induced for this concept, but there's an author that I really love, um, named Maurice Cotterell. I believe he's an Irishman. He may be Welsh, and he has some incredible books, and he talks about how he believes the great sunspot cycle, 7 years, 7 years, 7 years, 14 years, 7 on, 7 off, 7 positive, 7 negative. Um, Obviously, those cycles have a much larger um, sequence, but that's his main sequence is 7 years positive, 7 years negative. That you hit these minimums and maximums where the entire globe, or at least an entire chunk of a hemisphere, becomes completely sterile. And the Peruvians, the Aztecs, the Olmecs, they found that they had to reduce the bombardment of I'm going to forget the name, UV rays, and that some of these temples, these fertility temples, were designed to completely block these rays so that they could still have babies. So these women, it's either that they would live in the temple for the entire pregnancy, or that it was underground. And I want to say that I think that a lot of these underground cultures may have gone underground because they knew of these sunspot cycles. That's just I don't have a ton of information on it, but that just kind of resonated with me because Maurice's stuff is really amazing. And since we were on the subject, I thought I'd bring it up.
Remember that time Jesus said, how often do you have to forgive someone asked? Is it 7 times 7? Jesus says, not 7 times 7, but 70 times 7, I think it was.
Was that what it is? Yeah, the 7 times 7 is what is in my head, but
well, he does it correct.
I'm not sure.
Jesus,
yeah,
70 times 7. I'll make sure. Forgive others 70 times 7. That one is someone at home is going to be like, oh, come on. You know that this is Matthew 18:21.
Yeah, exactly.
Didn't you read that issue of Jesus, Super Jesus? I forget sometimes the actual issue number, but that is a 490. I know that. Anyway, there's a number of points in the Bible though where they do 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine. Saturnalia is constantly, a lot of things are measured in 7.
Yeah. I mean, it's the dualistic idea of Saturn becomes very relative because you have so many people in the dark arts using those numbers, and it's definitely becomes a little muddy. I posted a picture here on my screen that you can cut to real quick, and this is Maurice's calendar and what he hypothesizes going by his calculations of sunspot cycles, the rise and fall of civilizations based on this. Again, here we are using a timeline that I absolutely don't really want to put all of my eggs in one basket here, but his work is really great. It's very interesting. So for those of you listening, if you haven't heard of Maurice Cotterell, he just came out with a new book in April, and it's been about 10 years since he wrote a book, and his stuff is epic. Great stuff.
How would you spell Cotterell?
Cotterell.
So
yeah,
I like that I can do this thing where I put the word as a banner on the screen.
Oh yeah, I like the banner. The baby farm banner is depressing, but hey.
Oh yeah, I was gonna change it. See, that's what I'm saying. It was time for something new.
It's going to be a powerful month for sure. So I'm sure a lot of people out there listening are already feeling it. But yeah, he describes, from the Viracocha warriors to the Litipalenque to the fall of the Mayans. Man, there's so Quetzalcoatl. It's just crazy that these people were well aware of these cycles, and they knew how to defend themselves from them and continue their race during these minimums and maximums. Yeah, every book on there is wonderful, but he describes how each one of these faces is a code on the Viracocha warriors, and they tell you that every face is different, but it's not true. There's 10 groupings, and each face is a symbol, and the way that their hair is tied, it calculates as they move the solar minimums and maximums. It's just incredible stuff. And also, he has a good mirroring with Lee from our Discord. He does a lot of the mirror image reversing stuff with Litipalenque and some of these other stone reliefs, and it's absolutely mind blowing. You can see some of it. Just go to his website and you can see some of his work. It's incredible. A little off topic, but not really.
Not at all. I think looking at the timeline chronology, especially, that's something that we're trying to, check out. It's almost exactly what we need to get back to in some ways, because a lot of what rebuilding requires is getting back to what everything is made of, and we have to really analyze this stuff. And I think it's been a while since we've done that. It's worth doing.
Yeah, and to answer somebody's question here in the comments, does this assume the sun is a giant ball trillions of miles away?
That's
no,
fair.
not at all. I don't think it has to be that way at all. What is the sun? How far away is it? I mean, it's all conjecture, really. I mean, what we're sharing here is conjecture, and it's important for people to know that.
Dude, it's like an ogre. It has layers.
Exactly. Absolutely. Yeah, it's very interesting, but again, you kind of have to live on the cusp of interesting, or whatever you think you're prepared to grasp. You should never be afraid to throw whatever model you have for the shape of the earth or how far away the sun is away tomorrow. You always got to be open to new information.
I had to use VeggieTales for this backdrop. Restoring Reality says 100 years ago this year, it became illegal to mail kids to the USPS. You know how child safety laws started? My dad's taught me that because he was in defense, criminal defense. So he public defender stuff. Like originally, there was no child safety laws. It started because there were animal safety laws. And so they said, well, isn't a child a sort of an animal? And so by definition, they're like, oh, I guess because before that, they were like, it just has to be taken care of like property until it's, emancipated. And until it's emancipated as a person, theoretically, like Victor would say, like gender was less relevant even before your puberty and your emancipation. So, the way that they looked at it, they were saying, well, it's kind of like a horse. I guess the kid's like a horse. Yeah, you can't rape a horse. You can't kill a horse. I guess you can kind of use that logic on it. All right, we'll let you get away with it. Yeah, you can't rape, kill kids. Send them in the mail.
Yeah, it's always like the last thing that they think
But
about.
We're still going to send bees in the mail. You can't take that away from us.
So interesting. Man, the bee thing. Yeah, don't get me started on parasites, and that whole concept is really interesting. Again, thought forms, egregores, what that really means, how language has been completely rewritten in a sense, and that we're kind of keeping ourselves in this lower state, just by how we interact with the people around us and how we communicate, like I said in the beginning, the idea of what hieroglyphs and glyphs in general and pictographs and all of these things and how they work in the brain is very interesting, and how people.
What I find really ironic is the exact YouTuber I expected to know the Bible reference did. That was pretty good.
Nice.
And I was wrong about it being Daniel. It was Joseph.
Close enough. But yeah, I mean, again, so interesting. Take of it what you will, but that takes us back to the 777s and the 28-day cycle. And man, this ties in so many things. Celtic lunar calendar, blah, 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 blah. It's really interesting. I'm not saying that any of this has to revolve around there actually being a ball floating through space. I mean, your paradigm needs to be, like water.
Can you zoom in a bit on that?
No. Maybe.
My God. Yeah. Try control plus or there you go. There's always a button these days. Beautiful. How our 28-day spinning sun regulates fertility in females. Right to the point. The hard-hitting stuff that we hit.
And this is what I was referencing. So this is perfect. He describes that these polymer buildings, that not only were they designed this way for structural integrity and to outlast, centuries, that they were integral for blocking these high points in sunspot activity where the ultraviolet spectrum was at such a high level it was aborted fetuses. They were aware of this. It's very interesting. This also ties in with please get started on parasites.
I know.
I think we'll have to probably try to do that one another time because we could just start in right on the egregore stuff and go into society and just everything about dualism, politics, segregation.
Well, let's concrete fertility and magnetism. I think that's the really important one. And what we could probably get a little bit of parasite as we end out of that, and I think we'll be good.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, like we've already been discussing, really, the spinning sun, like I said, it doesn't have to be the paradigm you're given by NASA or whomever you want to, I'm Earth shape agnostic, and same with the distance of these, whatever they are, this 3D reality is so interesting. I won't even begin to try to tell anyone that they're wrong about whatever their opinions are of it. But I think that maybe something was changed along the lines or throughout these low periods where you don't have the sun causing all of these abortions spontaneously, that's where the darker sects kick in with their vaccines, right? And they can make all of these tie in with certain events that fit their calendar or whatever deity that they're serving. And this, again, is where I start to divulge it again with the egregore, and that through language manipulation and, people who have studied Solomon maybe are a little more antiquated with the idea of what this means, the jinn, demons, or whatever that may mean to you.
Even people that study computers, I think, in your computer, you have different programs. They're called daemons. Yeah. And that's the way that Linux will actually write it on a system. Totally. I'll really quickly pop up an example of my favorite word game involving magnetism and sexuality, which Coral Castle by Edward Leedskalnin had created this, it's a giant coral freaking castle on the east coast of Florida, across from Ponce de Leon's Bimini to Florida path, where he thought the Fountain of Youth was. And so Edward Leedskalnin's got this machine which he called, I forget her name, what's it supposed to be, the girl, but he named her after this girl, Jennifer or Stacy or something weird like that. Someone's gonna know. But basically, she's the sweet 16. It has to do that she'll be perfect when she's a virgin at 16. But this guy doesn't seem nearly as perverted as all that. And I started realizing that, or I think, maybe it was Brittany was talking about this too, this idea that if you've got well, it seems like this. If you've got something that's really perverted, you turn it into pizza and ice cream. And if you have something that's pizza and ice cream and like your cars, people do talk about their cars like girls' names and things. So he's an engineer that tried to sex up his, it's like he called his laptop his girlfriend. He's like trying to sex up his engine. He's like, oh, she's a virgin motor. She's a virgin magnet. And you have 16 virgin magnets. And that makes this perfect perpetual motion system, etc. So that's one of my favorite word metaphors with sexual magnetism. And Wilhelm Reich did the same thing.
Yeah. You see that so much with magnetism, and again, these fertility rituals and how they just lump so many things into fertility, and how the way they explained magnetism, was, as you're describing it, it's kind of like sexually overt. And yeah, they just kind of took that and ran with it, and there's like, this keeps enough people off the scent.
I wish I knew more about, and I look into more now, after, as you mentioned it, sunspots, because I understand how they relate electrically, the radio distortion, and I've seen sunspot distortion. I've always been curious about it because it's a phenomenon that they hardly can really say they fully understand, and also that they predict it, the way they predict it, like they can predict sunspots happening, so they can predict a corona flare affecting
exactly
radio. That's interesting.
Yeah, and again, it goes back to magnetism.
That's the new electromagnetic astrology. It's magnetology or something.
Really, yeah, makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's just old, just new words on an old thing, right? That people really understood. I mean, gosh, again, this writer's fabulous. He connects every continent of the world to these same ideas through their buildings, through their art. It's incredible. Ties right in with what we were saying. But yeah, and then to finish it off, I guess, with perhaps leaving people with more questions than answers, but the idea of what Babel means, the allegorical idea of Babel, and connecting it back with Jehovah and the Old Testament, and what this Jehovah God was, or who he was, or what kind of control he still exerts today. And I believe that Jehovah is Jupiter, Jove. I mean, a lot of people believe that, but not everyone wants to say that the Old Testament God was a different God than the New Testament God. But going back to the Talmud, what do you know about the Talmud? What do they say about the Old Testament?
Very different seemingly.
Yeah, and they not always on paper, but they pretty much refute the New Testament. And, the Jehovah's their God, essentially. And there's so many interesting parallels through history about the peoples that went from more of a earth-based religion to a monotheistic religion. You will find that Jupiter is generally the symbolic leader of this group. And this can tie in with the distribution of gold and how currencies were molded around these same monotheistic gods. And it's like you can just see the control structure. They were just tightening the grip, of it all. And as we move into an incredibly strong planetary conjunction here in December, not only that,
I can't help but notice the Cooper belt is like the Koopa belt.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So funny again. The Koopa and Kubla, and that's an interesting route too, when you go down there, and then you can follow them to South America, and the elephant cult. Man, there's just so much. But yeah, going into this conjunction here where you're going to have Saturn exalting, in Aquarius, basically his home. And for those of you who aren't totally familiar with what I'm saying, this is a conjunction that's been mapped in almost all of these ancient temples. The causeway of the Pyramid of the Sun, and Mexico maps the conjunction perfectly, and a lot of these causeways that don't go north or south or east or west, that don't really have any set trajectory, I can almost guarantee you they're mapping these conjunctions. And every one of these kings, monarchs, whatever, they all made it a high priority to know when and where Jupiter and Saturn were going to be coming together. Now, what that really means, do I really believe they're planetary bodies in space or whatever? I don't really know what to make of it, except that it's some kind of energetic shift. And as they move within each other, as they get within 5 degrees, they call it going to war, and then as they're within, a degree of each other, that's when they're conjoined. And this is going to be real special because they're going to be at 0 degrees in Aquarius. They're going to be right on top of each other. And we haven't seen that in a long time, especially not in, Saturn's home. Yeah. And so many of these historical narrative names, they just break down to Saturn and Jupiter. I mean, you can chase it back. I mean, Jupiter has, he's the god of 1,000 names, essentially, the hero with 1,000 faces. Again, the inversions of these allegorical stories, how many Hollywood writers will reference, that idea, right? The hero with 1,000 faces. If you're not familiar with that book, it's another fabulous book. But it just shows you that the archetypes, they're so narrow, and that all of these characters could just be fanciful creations of the same person. And that, again, brings up what we've been saying, that the timelines just can't be as massive as we're told. And yeah,
it's pretty absurd that the baby eating Saturn is, that's quite a metaphor.
Yeah, and I talk a lot with Victor about what this really means, alchemically and allegorically, that Saturn is the reason, or the vessel through which we've fallen into physical form, right? This is the idea of the castration of his children, that we are separated from the more permanent etheric body, and we take this physical form, but we still have that connection, but it's been severely limited by what I believe is this mound grid hijacking of these old mound builders, possibly even the star forts. I can't quite say for certain if the star fort builders aren't part of the hijack. I don't know for certain. I feel like they aren't, because the true star forts, they're not massive and they're not meant to hold a bunch of people. And that's where you really start to see the egregoric group thought become a real problem. Again, that's where the language is changing, and the ideas of race and the stuff we've been talking about throughout the show.
So if we're looking through the last of you guys' questions, I feel like the one I liked the most was parasites. Is there anything that you wanted to comment on the comment section?
Oh, man. Yeah, I definitely want to get into that, but I mean, that in itself is a whole show. Yeah. Again, this goes with the idea of what an egregore is. My concept of perhaps the parasite mind being, insect, hive related, queen bee. This could be a hijacking from a fungus. This could be so many things, like we've touched on lightly, the puddle theory. There are a lot of really good ideas out there. Metasites. I'm not quite sure what he means by that, but
like metaphysical sites, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. There you go, for sure. Yeah, I think it's what it is. I don't think it's an actual giant queen bee that's living underground that's somehow infected everything. I think I would say interdimensional, if I had to guess. But it does relate directly with what I was saying about Jupiter and the descriptions of Jupiter and what he does and how he handles people that step out of line, and that it does relate to cosmic cycles, like you were saying, using that word. It comes back and back and back more and more to cycles. Yeah, I mean,
Dude, Echo the Dolphin. Why is it everything? Why is it always the same? It's always back to Echo. So it's 500-year cycles that the storm comes and they have to deal with the Vortex Queen. If you ever got that far into the game, that's the bad guy of the game. So it's pretty much the gnarliest Vortex Queen ever. And she's like a robot thing, and you have to time travel it back in time so it evolves into a nautiloid instead of killing everybody. But yeah, the Vortex Queen is nuts.
That's like the Black Monolith.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and
again.
So David Plate, who did the Cassandra series with 2001 and Kubrick, he's like the ABBA video guy. So So the source of the Vortex drones, the Queen is the mother creature from the hierarchy. She comes from, let me find it. Is it here somewhere? Oh man, hold on. Vortex Queen. I just saw it yesterday.
Wow, that's crazy.
It's
yeah, like the Kubrick stuff is amazing, you know.
Here we go.
All his movies really describe this parasite.
The home world of the Vortex Queen is the third world of the star system Cassandra, located at the head of the constellation Pegasus. And there's like Dolphinius is there.
Pegasus, you know, he carries the lightning for Jupiter, you know. So super interesting.
Yeah. So I think that we did a pretty good poll in there, everybody. And we'll have to do more stuff on parasites, as you say. It's actually like a huge thing. But I think that's basically where all this leads in terms of AI, augmented reality. Well,
you got me really thinking about this Echo the Dolphin stuff, though, man. The last time we talked, this is even more blown.
I swear, I'll get the episode out within the next week. It's freaky. It's amazing.
I hope so. I'm excited. Yeah. Well, thanks again, man. I'm just feel blessed to be on here just to talk to you and just have dialogue and throw these crazy, weird ideas around. You know.
Oh,
that's
dude.
what it's all about.
Yeah, I definitely want to do this again as soon as possible. And we're gonna do another one with Pia Tormi soon, and we should just keep making stuff. When are you doing something with Victor again? Even another one soon?
Oh, I have no idea.
Yeah, well, let's try to do something. Yeah, exactly. He's been doing a lot of stuff. Let's try to get something together soon because it's great. Yeah. And
thanks for having me.
Appreciate it, man. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Have a good night.